In the grim darkness of the far future, war is an unending cycle of brutality, where the distinction between victory and defeat is often blurred by the sheer scale of destruction. Among the many infamous conflicts that have scarred the Imperium, few can rival the catastrophic siege of Vraks, a war that lasted for nearly 2 decades, leaving an entire world drenched in blood and madness. It was not a mere battle, but a relentless war of attrition, where countless lives were thrown into the meat grinder of an ever-escalating conflict. Vraks itself was unremarkable, a desolate, dust-choked world of little strategic importance, at least at first glance. A bleak fortress planet, its purpose was singular: to serve as a colossal supply depot for the Imperium's wars, stockpiling weapons, ammunition, and equipment for the endless campaigns that stretched across the galaxy. Yet, in the 40K universe, even the most mundane worlds can become the stage for unspeakable horrors, and Vraks was no exception. The war that unfolded here was unlike most conventional sieges. It was not a straightforward clash of armies or a decisive strike aimed at shattering enemy command. Instead, it became a grinding contest of endurance, testing the limits of Imperial warfare. Trenches stretched across the surface in a tangled labyrinth of fortifications. Artillery bombardments reduced entire landscapes to lifeless craters, and wave after wave of soldiers perished in futile charges against an enemy that refused to break. The very ground of Vraks became a graveyard, soaked in the blood of billions. But what truly made this war so horrifying was not just its scale, it was its nature. The line between order and chaos blurred as the conflict raged on. Fanaticism festered, discipline crumbled, and corruption seeped into the ranks. The Imperium threw everything it had into reclaiming this world, from the Astra Militarum to the elite warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. Even the dreaded Inquisition took an interest in the war, as whispers of darker forces at play began to surface. And so, as the final bombardments echoed across the barren plains and the last fortresses fell, one question remained unanswered. Who truly emerged victorious from the siege of Vraks? Was it the Imperium, whose forces eventually reclaimed the planet at a cost beyond measure? Or was it the forces of chaos, whose corruption had seeped so deeply into the war that even in death their influence lingered? Some would argue that no side truly won, only that Vraks itself became a symbol of the Imperium's endless struggle, a testament to the price of war in a universe where the notion of victory is often indistinguishable from utter ruin. With the stage set, we must now turn our attention to those who shaped this nightmare, the key players who fought and bled in the longest siege of the 41st millennium. The Siege of Vraks was a conflict of staggering proportions, drawing in multiple factions, each with its own motivations, tactics, and influence over the outcome. At the heart of the war stood the Defenders, those who had once sworn loyalty to the Imperium but had since turned against it. Opposing them was an Imperial war machine that refused to accept failure, deploying increasingly brutal and desperate measures as the siege dragged on. As the battle escalated, new forces entered the fray, each shaping the war in ways that would forever alter the fate of Vraks and those who fought upon its surface. The original spark of the conflict stemmed from a singular act of defiance. Vraks was under the authority of the Adeptus Ministorum, with the planet's stores of war materiel closely guarded by the Adeptus Administratum. To oversee these assets, a High Cardinal had been assigned to the world, acting as both religious and administrative overseer. His authority was backed by a personal force of soldiers, originally intended as a ceremonial guard, but later transformed into something far more dangerous. When the Cardinal declared open rebellion, the fortress planet's vast defenses became an impenetrable bastion, and the Imperium was forced into a prolonged campaign to reclaim its own stronghold. Leading the response was the Astra Militarum, the hammer of the Imperium. The siege was originally planned as a standard operation, utilizing the overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Imperial Guard to break through entrenched defenses. Regiments from across the Imperium were called upon, including those renowned for their expertise in prolonged warfare. The siege soon grew into one of the bloodiest engagements in their history, as traditional battlefield tactics proved insufficient against the deeply fortified positions. As losses mounted, it became clear that brute force alone would not be enough to secure victory. To support the war effort, the Adeptus Mechanicus played a crucial role, supplying the Imperial war machine with the munitions, siege engines, and logistical expertise required to sustain such an extended engagement. Their forges produced the artillery pieces that turned Vraks into an endless wasteland of craters and ruins. Their expertise in fortifications and heavy armor ensured that the siege continued even when it seemed impossible to breach the defenses. Though their presence was not as visible as the frontline soldiers, their influence on the battlefield was undeniable, as they provided the tools necessary to continue the war. As the siege dragged on, it became clear that the situation required more than standard military intervention. The Inquisition, ever watchful for threats beyond the material realm, took notice of the conflict. Their presence was not driven by concerns over battlefield strategy, but by something more insidious: rumors of corruption and heretical influence spreading among the defenders. When their worst fears were confirmed, they intervened with their own forces, escalating the war beyond a simple rebellion into something far darker. Recognizing the growing severity of the situation, the Imperium deployed its most elite warriors. Astartes chapters were summoned, their presence signaling that conventional means had failed. These warriors struck with surgical precision, targeting enemy strongholds and attempting to break the deadlock. Their role was not to replace the Imperial Guard, but to accomplish what massed infantry could not: decapitating the enemy leadership and turning the tide of the war. Though they arrived in smaller numbers, their impact was undeniable, shifting the momentum of battle at key moments. On the opposing side, the defenders of Vraks were no longer merely a force of rogue soldiers following a disgraced leader. As the war dragged on, their numbers swelled with those who had embraced the ruinous powers. No longer bound by the discipline of their former allegiance, they became something far worse. The once loyal garrison transformed into a host of zealots, their ranks swelling with cultists drawn from the depths of the Imperium's neglected underbelly. With each passing year, their connection to the Imperium grew weaker, while their ties to something else deepened. Among their ranks were war bands that had long abandoned the Emperor's light, answering the call of chaos and bringing with them the horrors of the warp. These warriors were unlike the conscripts and guardsmen who had initially defended the fortress, hardened fighters who had spent lifetimes waging war against the Imperium. Their presence introduced a new element to the conflict, turning the siege into something more than a battle over territory. It became a war for the very soul of the planet, with each faction vying for dominance over the ruins of Vraks. As the war neared its final stages, it became evident that neither side remained untouched by the conflict. The Imperium, desperate to claim victory, resorted to ever more ruthless tactics, deploying weapons and strategies that pushed the limits of acceptable warfare. Their foes, in turn, had abandoned any semblance of humanity, embracing the monstrous gifts of the dark gods. By the time the final battles took place, Verax was no longer just a fortress world. It had become a symbol of the war's true cost. The siege may have had an eventual conclusion, but the involvement of so many forces ensured that the question of victory remained ambiguous. With the stage set and the key players established, the next step is to understand how such a war came to be in the first place, the events that led to the rebellion and the war that followed. Vraks had not always been a battlefield. For most of its history, it was a heavily fortified depot world, operating under the rigid efficiency expected of the Imperium's logistical hubs. Its primary purpose was to store and distribute vast quantities of munitions, weapons, and military supplies to sustain the ongoing wars across the galaxy. This alone made it a valuable asset, but its location, far from the front lines, meant it was never considered a priority for defense beyond what was necessary to protect its stockpiles. Despite its importance, the governance of Vraks was not handled by the military, nor by any segment of the Imperium that specialized in warfare. Instead, authority over the planet rested in the hands of the Adeptus Ministorum. Administratively, it was overseen by a High Cardinal who wielded considerable influence, not just over the planet's operations, but over the faith of those stationed there. Unlike the frontline worlds where the Imperial Guard held direct control, Vraks was managed more like a monastic stronghold, where religious authority and bureaucratic procedures dictated everyday operations. For years, the system functioned as intended. Ships arrived, were loaded with supplies, and departed for war zones in need. The fortress world maintained its purpose without deviation. Its garrison, originally recruited to serve as a security force, remained largely ceremonial in nature. They upheld order, ensured that no outside forces interfered with supply operations, and maintained an ever-present symbol of the Imperium's might. But as with many such systems, it was only a matter of time before cracks began to form. Tensions first arose in the way authority was distributed. The presence of the Adeptus Administratum ensured that supplies were accounted for and properly distributed, yet their influence often clashed with the rule of the Cardinal. As a representative of the ecclesiarchy, his concerns were not only material, but spiritual. To him, Vraks was not just a warehouse of war, but a holy bastion of faith. Over time, his control over the world became more absolute, and his word began to carry more weight than the policies dictated by the Administratum. This shift in governance led to increasing friction, as those who were meant to oversee the planet's function found themselves subject to religious oversight rather than administrative order. Compounding this issue was the nature of the garrison itself. Without any external threats, its forces were not battle-hardened veterans, but stationed troops who spent years, sometimes lifetimes, on Vraks without ever facing true combat. As faith became the driving force of the planet's culture, discipline eroded in favor of devotion. The soldiers who once patrolled as wardens of Imperial logistics were now an extension of the Cardinal's influence, more bound to their spiritual obligations than to any formal military command. The shift in power did not go unnoticed. As the Cardinal's authority grew unchecked, concerns reached those beyond Vraks. Orders were issued to rein in his control, to ensure that faith did not interfere with the practical needs of war. But by then, it was too late. The planet's internal structure had already changed, and those who sought to challenge it were either silenced or ignored. The breaking point came when the Cardinal made his defiance clear. Whether through paranoia, ambition, or some deeper corruption, he cast aside any pretense of loyalty to the Imperium's governing systems. The planet, once a vital supply hub, was now in open rebellion. The garrison, once tasked with guarding the Imperium's assets, now stood as his personal army. With the stockpiles of war under his control and an entire fortress world at his disposal, he declared Vraks an independent stronghold, cutting all ties with those who had once commanded its function. The Imperium's response was swift, but not immediate. A fortress world, even one turned rogue, could not be retaken overnight. The logistical challenge alone was staggering. An entire planet's worth of defenses stood between Imperial forces and their objective. The sheer amount of war materiel stored on Vraks meant that its defenders were not merely holding out. They were equipped to withstand an extended siege. The world had been built to supply wars, and now that vast stockpile was fueling a conflict of its own. With the rebellion declared, the Imperium faced a dilemma. A direct assault was impractical, as Vraks was designed to repel orbital invasions. Precision strikes could cripple some of its operations, but the sheer depth of its fortifications meant that a full-scale siege was the only viable option. The decision was made to encircle the world, deploying overwhelming force to grind the defenders down over time. It was a war that would not be fought with speed but with patience, a relentless campaign meant to wear down resistance until there was nothing left. What began as an act of defiance soon spiraled into something far greater. As the siege took shape, external elements began to take notice. The defenders of Vraks were no longer isolated from the greater conflicts of the galaxy. Their defiance attracted the attention of those who thrived on chaos, while the Imperium's relentless advance drew in forces that sought to ensure the rebellion's failure. The war that followed was not just a battle for control over a fortress world. It became a clash of ideologies, strategies, and survival itself. With the planet sealed off and the first engagements beginning, the siege had officially begun. It was a conflict that would stretch beyond its intended scope, drawing in forces far beyond what had initially been planned. The battle for Vraks was underway, and as the first shots were fired, neither side could have foreseen just how costly the war would become. The first phase of the siege began with the arrival of the Imperial forces, their initial objective being to establish complete control over Vraks' orbit and isolate the planet from external aid. The defenders, entrenched within the fortress world's network of bunkers, trenches, and fortified supply depots, had no intention of surrendering. With access to vast stockpiles of weapons and munitions, they were more than capable of withstanding a prolonged siege. The Imperial strategy was built around slow, methodical warfare, ensuring that every advance was secure and that resources were not squandered in reckless assaults. The opening engagements were marked by heavy bombardments. Imperial artillery, brought to the surface in massive quantities, began the long and grueling task of reducing enemy fortifications. Siege cannons and earthshaker batteries pounded defensive lines, attempting to clear a path for infantry advances. However, Vraks had been designed to withstand orbital strikes and sustained artillery fire. The defenders had spent years fortifying their positions, creating layers of interlinked bunkers and trenches that absorbed the brunt of the bombardment. As the Imperial Guard regiments launched their first waves of assaults, they encountered stiff resistance. The defenders, knowing that retreat was not an option, fought with desperation. Trench warfare dominated this phase of the siege, with both sides engaged in brutal close-quarters combat over every inch of ground. The Imperium's forces had the advantage in numbers and firepower, but the defenders knew the terrain, utilizing underground networks and hidden supply caches to prolong the fight. Despite suffering heavy casualties, the Imperial forces pressed forward. The siege entered a second stage, marked by a shift in tactics. Rather than relying on large-scale offensives, the attackers began a process of systematic attrition. Strongpoints were identified and isolated, starved of reinforcements, then overwhelmed one by one. The Imperial war machine was relentless, grinding down the defenders through sheer persistence. Even as the defenders attempted counterattacks, they found themselves slowly being pushed back toward the heart of their fortifications. Months turned into years, and the nature of the war changed. The defenders, who had initially fought under a unified command, began to fracture. The prolonged siege took its toll, breaking both morale and discipline. Infighting spread among the ranks as different factions sought to claim control. Some remained loyal to the original cause, determined to resist until the end. Others turned to more radical solutions, seeking salvation beyond conventional means. The shift in the defenders' tactics did not go unnoticed. Reports of unnatural occurrences and disturbing battlefield encounters reached Imperial command. What had begun as a war against a well-supplied traitor force had now become something far worse. The defenders had begun to change, their ranks swelling with those who had given themselves over to the influence of darker forces. The siege had become more than a battle of attrition. It was now a war against something the Imperium could not afford to ignore. Recognizing the growing severity of the situation, the Imperium escalated its response. More regiments were deployed, including elite shock troops and specialized siege units. With reinforcements arriving, the offensive resumed with renewed intensity. Strongholds that had once been considered unbreakable were systematically dismantled, their defenders crushed beneath the relentless advance. By the later stages of the siege, the once imposing fortress world was a shattered ruin. The defenders, no longer the disciplined force they had once been, had devolved into fragmented war bands, each fighting for their own survival. The Imperial forces, having spent years grinding through miles of fortifications, now stood on the brink of final victory. Yet, even in its dying moments, the war on Vraks refused to end cleanly. The final battles would determine not just the fate of the planet, but what would be left of those who had fought to reclaim it. The turning point of the siege came not with a single battle, but with a decision made far from the trenches and ruins of Vraks. After years of brutal combat, Imperial High Command faced an undeniable truth. The siege had dragged on far longer than anticipated, and the cost in both lives and resources had reached levels that could no longer be ignored. What had started as a mission to reclaim a fortress world had spiraled into a war of attrition with no clear end in sight. Entire regiments had been consumed by the conflict. The landscape had been reduced to lifeless ruin, and yet the defenders still held key strongpoints. The conventional approach had failed to bring about the decisive victory the Imperium sought. Recognizing the need for a different course of action, a strategic shift was ordered. Rather than continuing the slow, methodical push through the remaining fortifications, the Imperium decided to escalate the war to a level beyond what had previously been considered acceptable. This was no longer a campaign of reclaiming lost ground. It was now an effort to ensure that Vraks and all within it could never serve as a staging ground for the enemy again. The first stage of this new directive was the deployment of specialized forces with orders not just to capture enemy positions, but to annihilate them entirely. The relentless grinding advance was replaced with targeted extermination, ensuring that every remaining defensive stronghold was not merely overrun, but utterly eradicated. Tactical bombardments were escalated, targeting not just known enemy positions, but any area suspected of harboring resistance. The intention was not just to force a surrender, but to render the planet uninhabitable for the defenders. This shift in strategy marked the moment when the war changed from a siege to a full-scale purge. The defenders, having already suffered immense losses, found themselves unable to regroup. Their strongholds were no longer merely being assaulted, they were being erased. The surviving leadership attempted to consolidate what forces remained, but it was too late. Their numbers had dwindled, their supply lines were gone, and their ability to mount any form of organized resistance had been shattered. At the same time, another order was given, one that would ensure no trace of the rebellion would remain. The Imperium's most extreme measure, one that had been reserved for only the most desperate of circumstances, was finally invoked. Exterminatus had not yet been declared, but the planet was effectively being treated as if it had been. No effort was made to preserve what remained. The world, once a valuable logistical hub, was now little more than a scorched ruin. With the defenders crushed and the final bastions falling, the siege was drawing to an inevitable conclusion. Yet, even as the last remnants of resistance were extinguished, the question remained. Was this truly victory, or had the cost been too great? The war had been won in the most absolute terms, but what had been gained in the process? The planet was no longer the fortress world it had once been. The stockpiles that had made it valuable were gone, consumed by war or reduced to wreckage. The Imperium had reclaimed Vraks, but what remained of it was a shadow of its former purpose. What had begun as an effort to quell a rebellion had escalated into something far worse. The strategic decision to escalate the war had achieved its intended outcome, but it had also exposed the limits of imperial warfare. Victory had come not through conventional tactics, but through sheer, overwhelming destruction. The consequences of that choice would be felt long after the last shot was fired. The end of the siege of Vraks left scars that extended far beyond the battlefield. The Imperium had reclaimed what was left of the planet, but at a cost so immense that it forced a re-evaluation of how such wars were waged. The fallout of the campaign rippled across multiple factions, institutions, and war fronts, reshaping strategies, policies, and the perception of warfare in the 41st millennium. For the Astra Militarum, the siege became one of the most infamous examples of a campaign that spiraled far beyond its initial objectives. The regiments deployed to Vraks had suffered astronomical losses, entire divisions being wiped out over years of unrelenting trench warfare. The resources funneled into the war effort, from manpower to ammunition and war machines, had drained supplies that could have been used elsewhere. Other conflicts across the Imperium had been neglected in favor of sustaining the war on Vraks, and in the years following the siege, many sectors found themselves weakened due to this prolonged diversion of forces. The aftermath also raised uncomfortable questions about military strategy. Vraks had been considered an impenetrable fortress, yet it had fallen, not through tactical brilliance but through sheer attrition. The Imperium had learned that even the most fortified worlds could be taken with enough time and overwhelming firepower, but at a cost that was often greater than the value of the world itself. This lesson did not go unnoticed by high-ranking strategists who debated whether the tactics employed on Vraks were sustainable. The siege became a grim case study on the limits of traditional warfare, forcing some within the Imperium to reconsider how future fortress sieges would be handled. For the Adeptus Administratum, the war represented a catastrophic failure in oversight. Vraks had originally been a stable, functional depot world, yet through neglect, poor governance, and unchecked religious authority, it had transformed into a battlefield that consumed millions of lives. In the wake of the siege, efforts were made to prevent similar uprisings, particularly on other fortress worlds. New protocols were introduced to limit the power of local religious figures over military assets, ensuring that no single authority could seize control, as had happened on Vraks. Inspections became more frequent, and the Administratum tightened its grip over vital supply hubs, fearing that another such rebellion could cripple war efforts elsewhere. The Inquisition, which had played a role in the later stages of the siege, found itself deeply concerned with what had transpired. The prolonged nature of the war had created an environment in which darker influences had taken root, and despite the eventual Imperial victory, the taint of heresy had not been fully eradicated. The aftermath of the conflict saw sweeping purges not just on Vraks itself, but among those who had fought there. The extreme conditions of the war had pushed many soldiers to the brink, and the Inquisition viewed this as a potential breeding ground for corruption. Investigations were launched into regiments that had served on Vraks for extended periods, and those found wanting were subjected to swift, merciless judgment. Meanwhile, the Adeptus Mechanicus assessed the damage inflicted upon the once functional fortress world and concluded that the cost of restoration far exceeded its value. The infrastructure had been shattered, the underground stockpiles depleted, and the surface rendered nearly uninhabitable. Rather than attempting to rebuild Vraks, the Imperium largely abandoned it, leaving behind only a token presence to prevent scavengers and opportunists from exploiting the ruins. What had once been a crucial supply hub was now a lifeless husk, a grim reminder of what unchecked rebellion and prolonged siege warfare could do to even the most fortified of worlds. Despite the devastation, the forces of chaos had not been entirely vanquished. Though the rebellion had been crushed, remnants of the corruption that had taken root on Vraks persisted. In the years following the siege, cult activity was reported on nearby planets, suggesting that those who had embraced darker powers during the war had not been fully eradicated. The sheer scale of the conflict had created an opportunity for chaos to spread its influence, and even in defeat, its lingering presence ensured that the battle for Vraks was not truly over. For the Imperium at large, the war on Vraks became a symbol of both perseverance and excess. It demonstrated the Imperium's capacity to endure even the longest and most grueling sieges, but also highlighted the staggering cost of such conflicts. The lessons of Vraks were debated in war councils, studied in military academies, and whispered about in the halls of power. Yet, despite all that had been learned, the Imperium remained bound to the same cycle of war, ensuring that the mistakes made on Vraks would likely be repeated elsewhere. In the end, the siege had been won, but the price of that victory left many questioning whether it had been worth the effort. The Imperium had reclaimed the planet, but at what cost? The question of who truly won the siege of Vraks remained unanswered, buried beneath the ruins of a world that had been reduced to little more than a graveyard. The siege of Vraks stands out not just for its sheer brutality, but for the unique aspects that have made it one of the most discussed conflicts in Imperial history. While most wars in the 41st millennium are marked by grand battles between vast armies, this particular campaign was defined by its slow, grinding nature, one that brought back the kind of warfare rarely seen since the darkest days of past millennia. Beyond the raw numbers of casualties and the staggering scale of destruction, certain aspects of the war have fueled discussions, debates, and theories among those who analyze its significance. One of the most striking aspects of the siege was how it became an unprecedented test of attritional warfare. While trench warfare is not uncommon in the Imperium's conflicts, the battle for Vraks took it to an extreme, mirroring the wars of ancient Terra in both strategy and suffering. The defenders had spent years preparing, constructing an intricate network of fortifications, bunkers, and underground supply routes that made every inch of progress costly for the attackers. Unlike most planetary sieges, where an overwhelming orbital bombardment or rapid shock assault could break enemy lines, Vraks forced the Imperium into a prolonged, systematic approach. Another key element was the strategic stubbornness of Imperial command. As the war dragged on, the logical decision would have been to escalate the response much earlier, deploying more specialized forces rather than continuing to commit endless waves of standard infantry to be ground down. Yet the Imperium refused to shift from its established doctrine until the cost had already become catastrophic. This raises the question of whether the campaign could have been concluded far sooner if different strategies had been employed from the beginning. The hesitation to deploy more extreme measures earlier in the war may have prolonged the suffering of the forces involved. The involvement of certain factions in the latter stages of the war remains another heavily discussed point. The presence of elite warriors who were usually reserved for more critical war fronts indicated that the Imperium had, at some level, recognized that the siege had spiraled beyond initial expectations. However, the timing of their deployment has led to speculation that their intervention was not simply to secure victory, but to contain something that had developed on Vraks. Some believe that had they arrived earlier, the conflict could have been resolved more decisively, while others argue that their late arrival suggests that the Imperium was initially reluctant to acknowledge the true scale of the threat. One of the most unsettling aspects of the war was the sheer scale of corruption that took hold among the defenders. What had begun as a rebellion driven by discontent and misguided faith had evolved into something far darker. Over the course of the siege, the transformation of the enemy into something unrecognizable led many to wonder whether the war had truly been about reclaiming a lost world, or if the Imperium had unknowingly walked into a conflict that had been manipulated from the start. This fuels speculation that the siege was not merely a military campaign, but a hidden war within a war, where forces beyond mortal comprehension had an interest in dragging it out for as long as possible. The final years of the siege also revealed something chilling about the nature of warfare in the 41st millennium. As the Imperium committed more and more resources to the battle, the question of what truly constituted victory became increasingly unclear. By the time the final fortresses had fallen, Vraks was no longer the valuable supply hub it once was. Even with the defenders annihilated, the world itself had been so utterly devastated that it was no longer capable of serving the Imperium in any meaningful way. The outcome of the war challenges the conventional understanding of victory, as the Imperium technically achieved its goal, yet gained nothing in return. Another point of discussion is the lingering effects of the war on those who survived. The psychological toll on the soldiers who fought on Vraks was staggering, with many being reassigned to other war zones only to suffer extreme instability due to the horrors they had endured. Those who had spent years in the trenches of Vraks had been conditioned to a level of suffering and violence that made them ill-suited for conventional warfare elsewhere. The lasting trauma of the siege was such that entire regiments were disbanded or reassigned to less critical roles, their combat effectiveness permanently diminished by the war's toll. Finally, the war's legacy as a cautionary tale remains one of its most unique aspects. It serves as both a testament to the Imperium's resilience and a grim reminder of its inherent inefficiencies. The siege is often referenced in discussions about the limitations of Imperial strategy, showing how the Imperium's insistence on overwhelming force often results in victories that are functionally indistinguishable from total losses. Vraks is one of the clearest examples of how the Imperium's war machine grinds forward, regardless of the cost, and why, despite its vast resources, it is constantly at risk of overextending itself. The discussion surrounding Vraks continues as its impact lingers in military doctrine, historical analysis, and the minds of those who attempt to understand what truly transpired there. Whether it was a necessary lesson or an avoidable disaster is still debated, but what remains certain is that the Siege of Vraks is one of the most significant examples of the Imperium's eternal war, where victory and defeat are often indistinguishable. Among the countless soldiers, commanders, and zealots who fought in the Siege of Vraks, a few individuals stood out, either for their leadership, their ruthlessness, or their sheer influence on the course of the war. Their decisions shaped the battle, their strengths and weaknesses determined its outcome, and their legacies left lasting marks on the Imperium and beyond. At the heart of the conflict stood the High Cardinal, the man who initiated the rebellion and transformed a loyal Imperial world into a fortress of defiance. He was not a warrior, nor a general trained in battlefield command. His authority stemmed from faith, his control over Vraks built on years of unchecked power granted to him by the ecclesiarchy. He was a fanatic in the truest sense, unyielding in his belief that his cause was just, even as the war spiraled into horror. His strength lay in his ability to inspire loyalty, convincing thousands to follow him into open defiance against the Imperium. Yet, his greatest weakness was his delusion. He lacked true military acumen and failed to recognize the scale of the force that would inevitably be sent to crush him. As the siege dragged on and his followers dwindled, his grip on reality weakened, and in the end, he became little more than a symbol of the war's descent into madness. Opposing him were the Imperial commanders who orchestrated the siege. The initial leadership of the campaign was rigid in its adherence to standard doctrine, relying on attrition to wear the defenders down. Their methods reflected the Imperium's approach to warfare, overwhelming force applied over time, without deviation. However, as the siege continued, their inability to adapt led to stagnation. The first waves of commanders were eventually replaced, their failures evident in the staggering casualty numbers and lack of progress. It was only when new leadership arrived, more pragmatic and willing to escalate the war to extremes, that the tide began to shift. One of the most significant figures to arrive later in the siege was a commander who understood that the war could not be won through conventional means alone. Unlike his predecessors, he recognized that brute force had reached its limits, and that the defenders had entrenched themselves too deeply for a standard siege to succeed. He advocated for more ruthless measures, pushing for the use of specialized forces, more devastating bombardments, and a shift in focus from capturing Vraks to ensuring its complete ruin. His greatest strength was his ability to see the broader picture of the war, recognizing that continuing as before would only lead to further stalemate. However, his methods left little room for mercy, and his reputation among the surviving Imperial forces was mixed. Some viewed him as a savior who finally brought an end to the war, while others saw him as the architect of the siege's most brutal phases. On the side of the defenders, as the war progressed, figures emerged who embodied the transformation of the rebellion into something far more dangerous. One such individual was a leader who rose from the ranks of the original defenders, proving himself not just as a capable fighter, but as a charismatic figurehead. Unlike the High Cardinal, who led from a place of faith, this individual commanded respect through sheer battlefield presence. He was pragmatic, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to ensure that Vraks did not fall easily. His strength was his ability to keep the defenders unified, even as the siege grew more desperate. However, as the war stretched into its later years, even he could not prevent the inevitable breakdown. His own survival became uncertain, with some accounts suggesting he met his end in the final battles, while others claim he disappeared, his fate unknown. The presence of specialized forces in the later years of the war also introduced individuals whose influence shaped the final outcome. Among these were those who carried out direct interventions, striking at key strongholds with precision and efficiency that had been lacking in the early years of the siege. These figures were not standard commanders, but specialists in extermination, individuals whose entire existence revolved around ensuring that wars ended decisively. Their strength was in their discipline, their ability to execute high-risk operations that standard forces could not. However, their very presence on Vraks indicated that the situation had deteriorated beyond standard military control, and their arrival, while effective, was ultimately too late to prevent the siege from dragging on to its bloody conclusion. The siege also brought forth individuals whose involvement was less about military strategy and more about the underlying forces at play. Some operated in the shadows, their objectives known only to a select few. Their actions were not aimed at reclaiming Vraks, but at ensuring that certain secrets never left its ruins. These figures remained subjects of speculation, with little concrete evidence of their identities or true purposes. What is known is that their presence coincided with some of the most devastating final acts of the war, leading to theories that Vraks held something more than just stockpiles of weapons, something that certain factions within the Imperium sought to ensure was never uncovered. By the time the siege reached its final days, most of the key figures who had shaped the war were either dead, missing, or recalled to other war fronts. The Imperium does not celebrate individuals in campaigns like Vraks, for the nature of such wars is not one of heroism but of endurance. The most notable names from the siege are those who either prolonged the war or ended it through sheer force of will. In the end, the defining trait of those who survived Vraks was not glory, but the ability to withstand the horrors of a war that few could ever fully comprehend. The Siege of Vraks remains one of the most infamous conflicts in Imperial history, but despite the overwhelming amount of documentation and analysis surrounding it, many questions remain unanswered. Some of these uncertainties stem from the nature of the war itself, prolonged, chaotic, and marked by brutal attrition, while others point to deeper mysteries that have fueled speculation among historians and military strategists alike. The true scale of the war, the fate of certain individuals, and the lingering consequences of the siege continue to be debated. One of the most persistent questions is whether the siege could have ended sooner had the Imperium approached it differently. The war dragged on for years, consuming unimaginable resources and manpower, yet some argue that it was prolonged not by necessity, but by stubbornness and mismanagement. The Imperium had options it chose not to exercise until the final years of the conflict. The refusal to deploy overwhelming force in the early stages or to use more extreme measures earlier suggests that the war may have been extended by bureaucratic inefficiency rather than military necessity. Some have even proposed that there were political reasons behind the drawn-out campaign, perhaps as a way for certain imperial figures to justify further military funding or to secure their own positions within the hierarchy. Another mystery revolves around the extent of corruption among the defenders. While it is well documented that elements of the traitor forces turned to darker influences, the question remains, was this a natural progression, or had Vraks been tainted long before the rebellion began? Some believe that the initial revolt was never a purely political or religious uprising, but was instead orchestrated by unseen hands, manipulating events to ensure that the planet descended into madness and bloodshed. The timeline of events suggests that certain elements within the Defenders may have been aligned with darker forces long before open war began, raising questions about whether the Imperium was fighting a rebellion or an enemy that had already been waiting for its moment to strike. The fate of certain key figures remains another unresolved issue. While some of the major commanders and leaders of both sides were confirmed dead by the siege's end, others simply vanished. Among the defenders, there are unconfirmed reports of high-ranking individuals disappearing in the chaos of the final battles, their bodies never recovered. Some speculate that they managed to escape through hidden tunnels or that they were extracted by outside forces. If true, this raises concerns that remnants of the rebellion may have survived beyond Vraks, possibly regrouping elsewhere. The possibility of rogue warbands continuing their cause beyond the ruined world is not far-fetched, especially given how many other conflicts have seen similar escapes. There is also significant debate regarding what was truly lost and gained in the conflict. The Imperium reclaimed Vraks, but the planet itself was rendered useless. The war consumed so many resources that it arguably weakened nearby war fronts and left the Imperium vulnerable in other areas. Given the staggering losses suffered by the Astra Militarum and the sheer amount of equipment expended, some question whether this so-called victory was anything more than a hollow claim. The defenders had been annihilated, but they had succeeded in bleeding the Imperium dry in the process. If victory is measured by long-term consequences, some argue that the defenders may have achieved their goal, ensuring that Vraks would never be a functional supply hub again. Another major point of speculation is the true reason behind certain late-stage interventions. While the arrival of elite forces toward the end of the war is often attributed to strategic necessity, there are those who believe they were sent not merely to ensure victory, but to contain something that had developed on Vraks. Rumors persist that the war had uncovered, or perhaps created, something that could not be allowed to leave the planet. The sudden shift in the war's tone, the escalation of destruction, and the final near-total erasure of what remained suggest that the Imperium may have been covering up something beyond the rebellion itself. If this theory holds any truth, then the real purpose of the later stages of the siege was not to reclaim the world, but to ensure that no trace of whatever had taken root there remained. The long-term consequences of the siege are also subject to speculation. With Vraks abandoned and the war considered one of the most grinding and costly in Imperial history, some wonder if the Imperium truly learned anything from it. Despite the war's failures, the Imperium's reliance on attrition warfare and massive troop deployments remains unchanged. The siege could have served as a lesson in the inefficiencies of prolonged campaigns, yet history suggests that similar mistakes have been made time and time again in conflicts since. This raises the question of whether the Imperium is even capable of adapting, or if it is doomed to repeat such costly endeavors indefinitely. Lastly, the question of who truly won the Siege of Vraks remains one of the most debated topics. The Imperium regained control, but at a cost so high that some argue it lost more than it gained. The defenders, while ultimately annihilated, succeeded in turning Vraks into a symbol of resistance and attrition, proving that even a well-prepared Imperial world could become a prolonged war zone under the right conditions. Chaos, while appearing to have been purged from the planet, may have spread its influence further through those who fought in the war, ensuring that the taint was never truly eradicated. In the end, the war did not conclude with a clear victor, only devastation, exhaustion, and the realization that even in victory, the Imperium had suffered another wound that would never fully heal. The Siege of Vraks may have ended, but its impact continues to ripple through the Imperium in ways that stretch far beyond the ruined world itself. Wars in the 41st millennium are rarely fought for ideological victories. They are waged to secure resources, reclaim lost territory, or eradicate enemies deemed too dangerous to be left alive. In this regard, Vraks presents a troubling example of a campaign where none of these objectives were fully achieved. The world was recovered, but it was left in a state so devastated that its strategic value was effectively nullified. The enemy was defeated, yet the cost of victory was so immense that it raised questions about whether such conflicts could even be considered victories at all. One of the most immediate and lasting consequences was the depletion of the Astra Militarum forces assigned to the siege. Entire regiments were consumed by the years-long war, not just in terms of casualties, but in terms of morale and effectiveness. Many units that had fought on Vraks were either disbanded or reassigned to less critical war zones, their ability to function in standard battlefield conditions permanently damaged by the psychological toll of the conflict. The level of brutality they endured, years of trench warfare, relentless artillery bombardments, and the slow, grinding nature of the campaign had created soldiers who were no longer suited for the fast-moving, large-scale engagements that the Imperium often required. The survivors were either too broken to serve effectively or too conditioned by the horrors of Vraks to function outside of siege warfare. The impact on military doctrine was another major consequence. The siege exposed the inherent weaknesses of the Imperium's reliance on overwhelming numbers and attrition warfare. While this strategy eventually succeeded, it did so at such an extreme cost that high-ranking Imperial strategists were forced to reconsider how similar sieges should be handled in the future. Some argued that greater use of specialized forces earlier in the campaign could have shortened the war significantly. Others pointed out that a more decisive initial strike, one that targeted leadership figures or crippled enemy fortifications outright, could have prevented the war from dragging on for so many years. While the Imperium is notoriously slow to adapt, the lessons of Vraks were studied in certain military circles, leading to incremental shifts in how planetary sieges were planned. For the Ecclesiarchy, the war was both a warning and an embarrassment. The fact that a High Cardinal had been able to amass such power, turn an entire fortress world into his personal domain, and sustain a rebellion for years called into question how much oversight truly existed over the more powerful figures within the religious hierarchy. In response, the Imperium took steps to limit the independent control that religious authorities could wield over fortress worlds and key logistical hubs. While faith remained an essential tool of Imperial control, the siege had proven that unchecked religious zeal, combined with access to military resources, could lead to catastrophic consequences. Increased scrutiny of high-ranking ecclesiarchy officials followed, with certain individuals quietly removed from power to prevent similar incidents from occurring elsewhere. The Inquisition, which had been forced to intervene in the later stages of the war, also took notice of what had transpired. The level of corruption that had taken hold among the defenders raised concerns that the forces of chaos had a far deeper reach than initially suspected. While the rebellion had started as a matter of political and religious defiance, it had evolved into something much darker. The Inquisition understood that if such corruption could take root on Vraks, a world firmly under Imperial control, then similar events could be unfolding on other fortress worlds without detection. In the years following the siege, the Ordo Hereticus increased its investigations into garrisoned military forces, leading to purges of officers and commanders who displayed any signs of ideological deviation. The siege had made it clear that internal threats could be just as dangerous as external enemies, and the Inquisition was determined to ensure that another Vraks would not emerge elsewhere. Beyond the Imperium, the aftermath of the war sent a message to its enemies, but that message was not as clear as the Imperium might have hoped. On the one hand, it demonstrated that even the most deeply entrenched fortress worlds could be reclaimed, eventually. The Imperium's ability to sustain a siege for over a decade and commit endless waves of soldiers showed that no matter how long it took, it would not abandon a campaign once it had begun. However, the sheer level of destruction and the cost in lives also revealed the Imperium's vulnerabilities. Its approach to war was inflexible, and in conflicts where time and resources were a factor, it could be bled dry. If a single rebel-held fortress world could drain the Imperium so severely, then what would happen if multiple uprisings or prolonged sieges erupted across different sectors at the same time? The chaos war bands, traitor legions, and heretical cults took note of these weaknesses. While the defenders of Vraks had ultimately been destroyed, they had managed to hold out for an astonishing length of time, proving that even a well-fortified world could become a quagmire for the Imperium. The lesson was clear. If similar strongholds could be established elsewhere, and if they could draw Imperial forces into another prolonged war of attrition, They could weaken entire sectors and divert forces away from other battlefronts. The war had shown that the Imperium could be made to fight wars that were strategically meaningless, bleeding it of soldiers and supplies in battles that ultimately left nothing of value behind. The long-term fate of Vraks itself remains uncertain. While the world was officially reclaimed, its ruined surface and shattered infrastructure left little of use for the Imperium. It was no longer a functioning supply hub, nor was it valuable enough to fully rebuild. In the decades following the siege, only a minimal Imperial presence remained, primarily to ensure that nothing emerged from the ruins. Yet, whispers persisted that the planet was not entirely abandoned. Some claimed that scavengers, cultists, or even remnants of the original defenders still lurked beneath the ruined fortifications, hidden in the vast underground tunnel networks that had once sustained the war effort. Others speculated that the deeper impact of chaos had not been fully purged, and that the planet would remain tainted long after the last shot had been fired. Ultimately, the siege of Vraks did not end with a clean victory. The Imperium won in the strictest sense. It reclaimed the world and eliminated its enemies. But the cost of that victory left lasting scars. The war had drained resources, exposed weaknesses in Imperial doctrine, and raised questions about whether the Imperium could afford to fight such wars again in the future. If anything, the war had proven that even a single rebellious world, if properly fortified and supplied, could hold off the Imperium for years. The question that lingers is whether those who seek to challenge the Imperium elsewhere have learned that lesson, and if the Imperium will ever truly be able to prevent another Vraks from happening again.